Hi, I'm Wes, the Explosion, and the Game Boy Mega Man titles, Rockman World and Japan, have a pretty basic format. Take half of the bosses from one NES game, slap in half of another, add in a new original boss, and a unique Wily machine, and while the execution can somewhat vary, that's pretty much it. Or it was until 5, when, after seeming to finally perfect the formula in 4, I guess Capcom cut Minakuchi loose, letting them make a brand new roster of enemies and change Mega Man's Buster, while still keeping much of what worked. And what we got was what's largely considered the best game in the side series, many even citing it as an overall favorite, so the extra freedom definitely paid off. And as you can probably guess, it's the last one I need to cover. So let's get going and finish this out. So Wily's been defeated and everything's pretty peaceful and cool, until one day when Rock and Roll are on a walk and some big-haired robot appears before them. His name's Terra, he's one of the Star Droids, a group of galactic robots, and after the Mega Buster fails to even scratch him, he kicks Mega Man's butt. When our hero awakes, he's informed that the Star Droids have invaded Earth, but his Buster has been upgraded into the Mega Arm, which is much more powerful, to combat them. He then sets off to drive the bad guys out. I think this is really fun. While I'm fine with same villain, just new plan and army, Mega Man fighting off an alien invasion is something that we don't really see anywhere else, other than Star Force and Battle Network 4. But we don't like to talk about that second one. While he has been to space and there's a few oddball alien robots here and there, fighting a full roster from beyond really opens up the scope of things. Spoiler alert for this next part, though it's gonna get brought up a few times throughout, so pause this and play the game yourself if you're worried. While Wily does wind up being behind it all, it seems much more one of those messing with powers beyond his control situations. Him merely freeing the Star Droids and thinking that he can keep them under his command. So while there is the typical, oh, Wily again, huh? Annoyance near the end, it's kind of a pleasant surprise when Sunstar turns on him and then goes on to fight Mega Man for his own reasons. And while it's not a lot, there is some text in-game, during the opening, at major story junctions, and the like. So the tale is a bit more filled out than normal. Terra seems to want Mega Man to join them, and seems offended when he destroys the Star Droids instead. Maybe saying that Mega Man would be his slave wasn't the best introduction. And there's a moment of understanding between Mega Man and Sunstar at the end, so we get a bit more than usual for a classic game. Though with as interesting as the Star Droids are, I kinda want more. Not surprising that they were featured pretty prominently in the Gigamix manga. In less stellar news though, I'm not sure if this is actually canon. The Mega Man killers all show up as DLC in 10, so they count, but given that this game starts out by saying that Wily's 4th world domination plot has been thwarted, it kinda makes the Game Boy titles seem like they might be their own timeline, which I blame Quint. Still, assuming Capcom ever touches Mega Man again, it would be cool to see these guys brought into the fold officially. You can run, you can jump, you can shoot, but rather than a charge shot, hold the button long enough and you throw your fist out instead as a rocket punch. While you want to hit enemies directly with it, if you miss but manage to clip something on the rebound, it'll still do some damage. The store is also back if you get enough P-chips, and while you can get the same standard power-ups like lives and tanks, you can also further upgrade your fist. One will let the Mega Arm grab onto an enemy and give a few squeezes for extra damage. Another lets the arm grab stuff and bring them back to Mega Man. This is really good, not just because you can get stuff out of reach, but sometimes it'll snag drops before they can fall into pits or spikes. And there's also some power-ups behind obstacles designed to make use of your weapons that you can just bypass by reaching out a hand. The Mega Arm can be a little finicky though. It's sometimes hard to tell whether you're charged up enough to send it the full distance, it seems random a lot of times whether it'll do the grabby hand or just come back, and you can't send out any more attacks until it returns to you. It can also be hard to angle it correctly to grab some power-ups, but at the same time, it's really fun to use. It packs a wallop, there's a lot of things you can cheese with the item grab, and it adds a bit of spice to the normal jump and shoot formula. When saving up P-chips, I'd recommend going for the item retrieval first, since that'll make it easier to collect more chips, then the extra damage, then the energy balancer, since from the second set of stages onward, ammo doesn't refill in between. Oof. For the previous Game Boy titles, I could just say, like the NES games, but on a smaller screen. though I'm gonna have to be a bit more detailed here. Okay, so you get 9 weapons, 8 from stage bosses, then the last from Terra, serving as the extra story boss. Grab Buster is just a straight shot, though the enemy drops a bit of health that comes back to you, so you can use it for a guaranteed drop. Bubble Bomb floats upwards, then crawls along the ceiling before exploding upon collision, so good for enemies hanging outside of your normal range. Photon Missile has a slow startup, but then rockets ahead with a piercing effect. If you launch it right on top of an enemy though, the rev time doesn't matter much. Salt Water throws a glob ahead that scatters into 3 smaller splashes when it hits a surface. Electric Shock throws a current out in front of you, which you can hold, though you can only move by jumping while it's active. Black Hole sucks things in before firing stuff out. Deep Digger is just new super arm, though the blocks are smaller, better integrated into the environment, and you pick the blocks up by standing on top of them. Break Dash needs to be charged, and like it sounds, it's an offensive forward movement that can break some blocks. Has iframes though, so you don't gotta worry about taking damage in the process unless you're really sluggish. Spark Chaser throws out a laser that will home in on an enemy and will move around a few times, so you can get multiple hits with one use. You can turn your brain off for this one, or better yet, use it when you need to attack but have to dodge at the same time, just letting you concentrate on one. Oh, and of course you can find both Rush Coil and Jet, which work as normal. You also get Tango, who pops down to jump and spin dash around and take out enemies. You need to charge to use him, and he does some pretty decent damage, so I guess think of him as a more freewheeling version of Beep. And that'll do it. There's definitely some similarities to past weapons here, yet most make a few tweaks to distinguish themselves, like the Break Dash's generous iframes, Salt Water feeling like a goopier version of the Crystal Eye, and while I thought that the Super Arm template would never return because it was kind of a pain to use, Deep Digger is pretty well executed here. Rather than put 2 big, dumb blocks in every boss arena, you really only get ones for this weapon when you need it, making it a little obvious that it's the boss weakness, but it still feels less intrusive. Plus, this one had Black Hole before 9, and while I feel like I'm forgetting something, I don't think we really have something similar to Spark Chaser, which can be pretty fun to watch go off. Yet, even while this is a pretty decent arsenal, I still find myself using these rarely. I definitely should use the Grab Buster at the very least, but whether it's because I'm less familiar with the weapons or the Mega Arm is just so good that I don't feel like I need to, I mostly break these out to take down a specific boss or to get rid of specific blocks. Also, make sure you remember who gave you what and what the first 2 letters of their name are. Photon Missiles are MA for Mars, not ME for Mercury. The stages are pretty creative in this one. The first 4 take place on Earth, so there's more familiar settings, like factories and a submarine, whereas the second set take place in space, which is sometimes utilized, though some still feel a bit terrestrial, but they all have a fair number of gimmicks. For Mercury, there's direction-changing conveyors and blocks that hurt you not just when they fall, but also when you walk into them, the tops being the only safe surface. Venus has bubble flooring where you can jump high if you get a running start and will bounce a few times upon coming down before you regain your footing. Mars has rocket platforms, landmines, and a sub-boss with descending bits of flooring you have to climb to get high enough to counter. Neptune's in a submarine, with an undulating floor near the beginning and all the water effects you could imagine. Saturn has differing gravity and enemies that can slow time. While Jupiter also has some floatier jump sections, you get standard gravity indoors and bigger jumps outside, so you need to mind the transitions. He also has some icy floors that'll make you slip, including in his boss room. Uranus's level is pretty much Egypt, but in space, with floors that'll drop you if stood on too long, and some that scroll by, as well as 2 rock-hucking sub-bosses. Pluto's level seems to be in some sort of mine, with a lot of falling platforms that you gotta move fast to avoid getting dropped, or having them dropped on you. Seems like a safety issue. And before the final level, they pull a Kirby, pop Mega Man into a space-worthy rush, and do an arcade shooter section. First, you dodge asteroids, then fight a few waves of enemies, 2 at a time, then you dodge lasers. This part is hampered by the small screen, you not always having the most room to react to stuff, especially that last part, but as long as you hang back for the first, then stay in the middle when the enemies are spawning for the second, and just keep on moving to where the last laser was fired before the next goes off for the final, you'll probably be fine. The last stage is a long one, but I kinda like how some of the enemies are redone to more match Wily's style, like the electric robots looking more like Joe's, or the little cannon enemies now being part of a mech. There's a few cheap spike placements where you can just fall into them because you need to take a leap of faith, and there's a lot of bosses in this one. Let's see, if we count different phases as separate, then 4, 12, 14, 16, 17 bosses in this one, which might sound a bit gratuitous, but since you have your full suite of abilities, with a lot of power-ups sprinkled around, plus hidden rooms and alternate paths if you're paying attention or just get lucky, it could be worse, and I think it's pretty fun. Though it would hurt to have to redo. They even give you a lot of energy refills and some extra E-tanks right after the boss rush, but before you take on Wily. Also worth mentioning is that in the second set of stages, there's 4 crystals you can find that will lower the weapon ammo cost if you get them all. This feels similar to the 4 letters you need to find to fight Wily in the previous game, just better hidden, but not required to succeed as a way of balancing the deal. One annoying thing about this though is that you need the break dash to get the jewel in Uranus' stage, and deep digger for the one in Pluto's, you getting the required weapon from the opposite one, so I don't think there's a way to snag them all without backtracking. With no stage exit in the game, it does make getting at least the one a bit of a chore. On the whole though, while some things I mentioned might seem wilder than others, we've seen some of this stuff before, it does feel like the classic game with perhaps the greatest stage variety, and that it manages to do a few unique things on top of that really cements this one as special. While a few do get a Wily facelift at the end, I think all the stage enemies are native to this game. That really gets across that you're dealing with a completely new threat, and with how most are just in 1, maybe 2 stages, it gives not just the game, but each area its own identity. But nothing does that more than the bosses, which, while still very much in the Mega Man art style, don't really feel like Robot Masters. I think that's because most RMs are designed for a specific purpose, that then gets weaponized, whereas each of these feels like just a cool robot design, with maybe only combat in mind. At most, I'd say that they're based more off of the Roman god each planet takes its name from. Mars here being a knockoff Napalm Man with a bunch of cannons for war, Neptune having scales and fins, Jupiter floating above and using electricity, and Pluto being ostracized for being a furry. Makes total sense. As for the fights themselves, Mercury is cool because he kinda feels like a smaller devil, being able to turn to liquid and move his parts around individually, though watch out because he can steal stuff from you. Like an S-tank. Venus throws out bubbles that can home in or just get in your way. Mars just kind of fires a lot of stuff at you really fast, to the point where I don't know how he can dodge it all, and he can also lay landmines. Neptune hops around and either throws salt water at you or shakes the stage to have it drip from the ceiling. Jupiter floats about, firing projectiles and sending a blast of electricity down, during which he's invincible. He also swoops after a set number of attacks, which I would say makes the window to counter him pretty limited if he wasn't in the second half of the game, guaranteeing that you'd have his weakness, the bubble bomb. In addition to doing a neat trick where he tosses his ring in the air and then slides, Saturn can also freeze you in place, then fire a bunch of projectiles. Uranus takes turns throwing blocks, swapping sides of the screen, and trying to crush you with the ceiling. Pluto dashes around and throws out projectiles, either straight ahead or from on high, so stay on your toes. As for special bosses, Dark Moon is a devil, pretty similar to the original Yellow, but it shakes the ground when it moves into frame, and when it's shifting its pieces, the top blocks bounce rather than just flying harmlessly over your head. Terra can freeze you in place, and he also fires his Spark Chaser, which will follow you, so keep moving. Before you get to the final level, there's that space section I mentioned, and at the end, you fight the entrance itself. You get super shrunk down for this one, and after the skull fires its laser, you want to shoot it in the mouth before it closes. While it readjusts its aim, either the cannons up top will fire missiles, which can home but can be shot down, or the ones on the bottom will just take pot shots. And as a special treat, the Mega Man Hunters and Quint are back. Each fight's pretty much the same way they did before, just a bit slower and more predictably, so that the small screen isn't a death sentence. Kinda makes me wonder if that's all they really had going for them, but it's still really cool to see them return. Before dealing with Wily, you have to tangle with the fist that will hover over you, then punch down. The eyes on its wrist, which are its weak point, get exposed when it does. Then you fight the second hand, which does the same thing, but faster, while also firing a homing missile when it drops, and will also grab you if you don't manage to slide under it while it's lowered. The trick is just getting the timing down. Then you get a machine that will cycle through firing 3 missiles that'll target where you're standing, a drone that will try to float you up into the ceiling spikes that you have to shoot as you pass, and trotting bombs that do actual damage. If it's a 1, just knock it into the Wily machine. If more than that, avoid it, letting it jump over you every time it turns even, then try to bait it and push it into the machine when it gets to 1. 5 hits should do it. When its base breaks, Wily becomes visible, the ceiling lowers, and you have to hit the top of the dome while leaping over shockwaves and not jumping too high, though at least the spikes here aren't insta-kills. And finally, there's Sunstar. He does a lot. He's got a lot of projectiles, a lot of movement options, can burn up the floor, and just really has a bunch of attacks to throw your way. Your first or even second time playing, it's easy to get overwhelmed, though if you have plenty of tanks and can use his weakness, the Spark Chaser, effectively, you can brute force him, if worst comes to worst. Overall, I like the roster here. The standard bosses are interesting and fun enough to fight. I still love Devils, the Hunters and Quint make the game feel like a celebration of the series, and the final sequence has way too many phases, but you going up against Sunstar instead of Wily is a really cool way to close things out. With as many attack patterns as they gave him, you can really tell just how much they poured into him and the game on the whole. As always, you get your pick of green, gray, and color, like with every Game Boy title. Color does a good job of differentiating each layer with different hues, though I will say things can be a little confusing with less options. Some stuff can kinda blend together, so I'd say go color if you can. Otherwise, it's mostly just NES Mega Man on a smaller screen with more basic shades. I think the character sprites look pretty great, all things considered. They did a good job designing the Star Droids especially, and each is well realized. As for the stages, while the gimmicks vary a good bit, none of the environments themselves are anything too crazy, though I will say that there's a lot of extra details in the background and foreground that prevent the game from looking too flat. You also get some nice profile art of the bosses on the stage select, along with a fun little map. Upon gaining a new weapon, you get a nice demonstration on a stationary enemy to show you what it can do. So yeah, I'd say the game has some pretty good visual presentation. The music is fine. I'm not as into it as most of the other games, but then again, I didn't grow up with this one and it is on limited hardware. Some of them, such as the Mars stage, while unique to this game, still feels like Mega Man. Others like Venus seem a little more out there though. Even without the deep-seated childhood memories, or some of the ones that I have more trouble identifying as a track from the series, they're still not bad. They fit the action well and are pleasant enough to listen to in the background. As for sound effects, all the ones you'd expect are there, plus the newer ones work well too. Like when you use your gropey hand, the little noise it makes really gets across the extra damage you're piling on. About the only one I'd say that can be a bit grating is, as usual, the noise for charging your weapons. I think most people will have trouble with this one, at least at first. For the basics, there's still the small screen, with proportionally bigger characters, the limited palette making some information less obvious than it should be, and just some in general malarkey that the Game Boy titles are known for, such as you needing to jump down to a lower screen, only to fall directly into some spikes that it's too late to dodge. Still, I'd say there's less of it this time. And with how the stages are divided up, you won't have a weakness for at least 2 bosses starting out. You'll need to earn Rush, and until you get the item retrieval for the Mega Arm, there'll be a lot of good stuff you can see but not reach, so early game is a little rougher than normal in this one. Still, to help counter at least some of this, it does seem like Mega Man takes less damage than I'd expect, especially against bosses, most of whom get dropped by their weaknesses but still aren't too bad without. The Mega Arm is really stinking good. They can be pretty generous with power-ups, and when you really get going, there's always the store where you can buy stuff to compensate for whatever you're struggling with. Well, outside of insta-deaths, no getting around those, other than literally getting around them. And if you happen to game over a lot on one stage, you'll get a free upgrade for your Mega Arm to make things a bit easier. Or so I've read. To swing back around, there's some stuff that won't be immediately obvious that you kinda have to learn, like how certain baddies work, enemy and obstacle placement which can sometimes be nasty, and how some of the odder gimmicks, like the bubble floors, function. And while that might sound basic, every game has a learning curve, There's a lot of tropes in Mega Man so that, even if it's your first time playing a certain game, you can normally intuit at least to a degree how things are going to work. So this one being as different as it is, makes it a little harder to pick up and can even wind up using your preconceived notions against you. Still, to pivot again, the game's pretty good about teaching the major stuff, like how they stick you in a normal room with no enemies in Jupiter's stage, before sending you right outside with its lower gravity to demonstrate that that'll be in flux. With all that said, 5 isn't as egregious as some other entries, so after just one run, you should have a pretty good grasp of how things work, and if that sounds like too much of an investment, most ways to play this these days will come with rewind and save states, so there's plenty of chances to learn without needing to play over and over again. If I had to sum things up, while I think this might be a bit much for casual players, at least without modern conveniences, I think more experienced ones will find 5 a decent challenge that they can have a lot of fun with. I have very mixed feelings with the Game Boy titles on the whole. I think I like Dr. Wily's Revenge and 2 more than I should, despise 3, and like 4, though I still have some significant gripes. And while 5 certainly isn't perfect, the parts that get under my skin are greatly outweighed by all the positives. Original stages, bosses, and music, with enough variety to constantly delight, with a cool setup, and callbacks to the games that came before, so while this was the last title in the side series, they really went out with a bang. While I'd recommend 4 to classic fans, with the 3 previous ones only to the most hardcore, I think 5 is the only one I'd suggest to anyone who likes platformers in general. It manages to avoid feeling redundant, and is just well put together and fun. That's why I think it's great that they put it on NSO, and I also hear that there's a fan remake in the works, both of which should make it a lot easier for new people to finally get their hands on this one. But that's enough out of me. What do you think? Have you played 5? Will you play 5? Love it? Hate it? Think it's overrated? Do you think it even rivals most of the mainline games? That'll do it for this week, so thanks as always for watching, and maybe consider subscribing if you're into platformers, especially Mega Man. Forever lasting peace.